Welcome to episode 205 of the CUInsight Experience. I'm Randy Smith, one of the co-founders of CUInsight.com, and once again, I am joined by my co-host.
That's me. I'm Jill Nowacki, the founder and CEO of Humanidei.
This is going to be fun, Jill. I like our topic today. But first, we've got some business to take care of. This episode is brought to you by Trellance. Trellance is a leading technology partner for credit unions, delivering innovative technology solutions to help credit unions achieve more. With a comprehensive suite of analytics, cloud, and talent solutions, the Trellance team ensures credit unions increase efficiency, manage risk, and improve the member experience. This season, Jill and I are taking a deep dive into leadership, credit unions, life, and what it means to thrive in the ever-changing world of financial services and leadership. We've got some incredible guests lined up. I just have to throw out, if you haven't listened to 204, our last episode, Mike Valentine was amazing. We are one day off GAC, and he was the recipient of the Herb Wagner Award, and you talk about authenticity. That we couldn't have picked a better guest for that. So hopefully, if you haven't, go back and take a listen to that one as well. But as I said, leadership, credit unions, life, and what it means to thrive in this world. Some more incredible guests that I can't wait to announce. We have a couple more on the schedule that I think y'all are going to love, and can't wait for them to share their stories. But today, you get Jill and I, and we're tackling a topic that we believe is more relevant than ever, and that's resilience in the face of economic shifts, industry changes, personal changes, challenges. How do leaders and organizations not just thrive, but how do we grow stronger? And what does resilience really look like in action? And how can our credit unions leaders cultivate that in themselves, their teams, even their members' lives? Jill, we've been doing this a while, and you've worked with a ton of leaders. What does all this mean to you? Why were you so excited about this topic? Because I know we both were.
Yeah, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about and researching resilience lately. While we're moving through uncertain environments, it just keeps emerging as the key to success. And so what I'm seeing is that those organizations, those individuals, those teams that can cultivate resilience are better positioned to navigate challenges and maybe even see how to come out of uncertainty ahead of the competition. So being able to use resilience as a differentiator is really key on this. And that's been inspiring to me. So I'm super curious about it. And so what I do when there's something I'm super curious about is dig into it, explore it more, research it more, and then talk about it a whole lot more. So that was why I was so excited about this topic for today.
You and I have had conversations around this for quite some time now. And for me, the one thing is I really do think watching people, we were just around a whole bunch of credit union leaders, and just even like mindsets and things like that as uncertainty, let's say, is in the air, how some react to, okay, how do we take advantage of this? How do we put our head down and go forward? And yet maybe others react in, I don't want to say can't get out of their own way, but as a leader, I feel like it is our job to make sure that we're not getting in the way of everybody else around us as well. So, I mean, this is just something that as organizations, the most resilient to me are the ones that end up on top in the end. So anyways, that's the reason I was like geeked to talk about this topic when we were going through our list of topics. I'm like, that's it. So I have a question to kind of kick this off. And as we were talking before, we're kind of going to break this podcast into, if you want to say, 3 different parts, right? And I'll kind of give everybody the heads up on that. We're going to talk resilient leadership. We're going to talk building resilient organizations. And then we're going to talk about the personal side of resilience, because guess what? We're all humans. So with that, resilience is often described as the ability to bounce back from adversity. But in leadership, it's really more than just recovery. It's about growing through challenges. I think the best credit unions and organizations grow through challenges. What qualities do you see in resilient leaders who not only have, say, withstood those tough times, there's people's names bouncing into my head right now as I'm asking this question, but also maybe come out stronger on the other side?
Yeah, I think it's important to think of when we think about resilience, what is it we think of? And it's not necessarily that person who has the Teflon coating or that perfect shell of armor there. But what I do see is that resilience and a growth mindset really go hand in hand. So those resilient leaders are able to embrace challenges. They can learn from failures and use that to move toward continuous improvement. And I think what's really important about resilient leadership is that those leaders who demonstrate resilience, they make it contagious. So it inspires confidence. It creates a culture of perseverance, and it inspires and engages that workforce around them too. One of the things that I think is really critical with resilience is that it's this ability to, so we talk a lot about the Harrison assessment in our life, and it defines this concept of what's called vigilant resilience as an ability to see that things can potentially go wrong, but to stay optimistic about it. And so that optimism to me is such an important trait of resilience that comes out of it. What about you? What do you think when you think of those traits and characteristics, that resilient leader comes to mind? What is it that's in your mind with that?
I think on one of the last episodes, we mentioned the book Unreasonable Hospitality, and the gentleman was just a keynote at GAC as well. But there was a line in his book that I remember taking a note down where it said, adversity is a terrible thing to waste. And that to me is, when I think about that resilient leadership, there's almost that mindset shift. It's not that you put your head in the sand and don't think things are difficult or tough, or this isn't going to be tough, but you see the obstacles. We talk a lot about, analyzing pitfalls and seeing what could go wrong. And sometimes they do go wrong, but then it's also like, then how do you turn that into the opportunity for growth? And I will tell you, when I feel like in my career, when things look rough across the board, so it's not just a CUInsight thing, but maybe it's a everybody thing, that to me is a time that you can really capitalize on being the strong one in it. Is that the chance to look at and say, okay, but what are the opportunities here? If everybody else is cutting back, how do we push forward? And things of that nature. So I think that's that idea of like really embracing, you said embracing the challenge, right? Not only a challenge, but embracing the challenge as a learning opportunity as well, because I'm 50. I've been through a few recessions. I've been through some ups and down times, whether it was personally or in companies. You tend to not touch the stove twice, or you learn something from it each time you're going through. So can you prepare yourself and say, sure, it's not going to be exactly like it was the last time, but you know what? No, I can get through this. And I think as a leader, if you have that confidence that this too shall pass, it's how do you position yourself, your team, your credit union to make sure that there's that like confidence, and that there's that like knowing that we're going to get through this and we can come out stronger, and can we actually be positioned better when we do? To me, that's a big sign of resilient leadership. I would throw something back that you know much more about than I do, but it was something that I was thinking of as I was preparing for this, was like that emotional intelligence to manage, your stress, stay composed, but also the empathy side, knowing that people are going through this also a lot of the times with you when there's uncertainty. And sometimes it may be even more outside the walls of the credit union, where like we don't know what happens when they go home. Could you talk a little bit about, from like, I guess that aspect? Because that was a place where I was like, oh, Jill's so much smarter at this than I am, but and kinder and everything.
Yeah. And you raise a few interesting things, and let's look at that, kind of imagine some expanding circles. And in this case, let's put the leader in the center of these circles. And so you have a leader who is facing a challenge, maybe let's say, facing economic uncertainty in the broader environment. And the pressure is on that leader to make sure the organization sustains. And it's certainly for, there's a very personal benefit where the leader doesn't want to fail at their job, but there's also a reality that the leader is holding the pressure of ensuring that the team can stay employed and ensuring that the members of the credit union can continue to be served. And so the leader may be in this situation where during this time, a high-performing leader reasonably will say, oh my gosh, I have to step up. I have to work harder. This is when we have to charge through it. And a reality may be that all of those other factors that may be happening outside, if we're helping our members navigate economic uncertainty, there is a solid chance our employees are also facing economic uncertainty. And so we have to be aware that these people who now we want to see the highest level of performance so that our organization can differentiate, but they may be heavily burdened by things that are happening outside of that organization. So the leader has to have this level of emotional intelligence that can inspire and motivate the the continued performance, but also that won't push those team members too hard to push them into a state of burnout and potential collapse on that. And so high levels of trust and transparency so that the employees feel comfortable saying, hey, I understand why you're pushing, but this is a step too far. I need a break or let me take a beat and come back to this for right now. And if the organization doesn't have that level of, first of all, transparency, so the leader can actually communicate why we're pushing so hard right now. Right. But that trust, the employee is feeling safe to say to the leader when enough is too much, and knowing that that's not going to cause some sort of you're dead to me retribution on that comes back with that. And that's a tough level of emotional intelligence to hold. Whereas the leader, you're saying, okay, all of this pressure for success, not just for me, but for everyone who depends on me, is with me. And I can't push the team members too hard past or into that burnout point too.
Something I've been thinking about that we've been talking a lot over the past few months about is that idea of when there's a lot of noise going on outside the organization. Like, I feel like as a resilient leader, you have to have a clear vision of what, even if it's tough times, perceived tough times, whatever it happens to be, that like the leader has to be there to keep the team aligned on what our vision is and what our scope is, quite honestly, right? Like what it is that we can control, what we can't. And that to me is something, and this is something like you're extremely good at, but that idea of clear communication, being able to communicate like, I hear you, this is what we do here. Whether it's a credit union, whether it's a company that supports credit unions, whoever it happens to be, to me though, that is one of those kind of hallmarks of a leader, is to say, okay, this is what we do, and this is why we're all here. So let's make sure that we're not straying too far from that when we're looking at what our vision is, I guess, or like, having that crystal clear vision.
I'm going to take a big risk here because I'm going to share an anecdote that I hadn't prepared to share. And so I may end up at the end of it and think, well, what was that about? But it sort of reminds me of, you and I were scuba diving once, and we were on a dive with a guide, and there was absolutely no visibility. Yep. And it was I was still a very new diver. And so we're going down, and it's like, you can't see anything. I couldn't see you. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. And yet we had a guide that was confident that if we just swam a little ways out, and that she felt she knew how to navigate us there, she could get us to a place where we could actually enjoy the dive. So in this case, she's the leader and I am not the leader. Yeah. And what she needed to do for us was we needed to trust that despite the fact that there was no clear vision right now, she knew what was on the other side, and she could take us there. And our role as her followers was to trust her enough that we would go through that cloud with her and get to something better on the other side. And sometimes the leader is that dive guide where they're the only ones who may be able to have that vision of how we move past the cloud of uncertainty, how we move past the obstacle, and that it's going to be worth it. But it's going to be real uncomfortable for a while. And I have never been more uncomfortable on a dive than that one. Because,
And I would also say she had to pivot because when we first went down, we couldn't see anybody and we had no plan. Because I was the last one to come back up. I'm like, everybody will show up at some point. And I got back to the surface and you guys were all just waiting for me. But then she had a plan after that. We all went back down and continued to dive. But
absolutely. Yeah.
She did have to pivot.
The plan to pivot, critical as well. Yeah.
There's one last thing. And then I want to move on to that, to really talking about the building organizational resilience. But I did want to, this was just a bullet point that I had in my notes. And that's, I feel like great leaders that are resilient stay focused on the long-term goals and make those informed, timely decisions, even when there is uncertainty. And I think that ties into what you were just saying, where it's like, they may be the only one to see it, but they stay focused. And, I'd go back to communicating that and making decisions in the moment. Sometimes you have to pivot, right? That's not what you expect. So a question for you here to get us going on this second part. Credit unions, like any organizations, we all face disruption, economic downturns, industry shifts, leadership transitions, something you deal a lot with, succession planning. We just had a leadership transition at CUInsight at the end of last year. So what are some of the tangible ways that credit unions can build resilience into their culture and operations so that they're not just reacting to change, but they're proactively preparing for it? Because to me, that's that companies that are able to, companies, credit unions, organizations, any of us that are able to act fairly quickly are resilient organizations. Like, we're not waiting for the world to happen to us, I guess. How about that?
Absolutely. So now I am going to call in some of this research that I've been doing recently. And several years ago, there was a great article in the Harvard Business Review about resilient organizations. And specifically, it did some research that looked into the 4 resilience advantages. And it's this idea that an organization can be resilient in one of several ways. So it can see those threats ahead of time, anticipate them, sort of analyze the pitfalls that may come and respond to them. That's called the anticipation advantage. Cushioning in credit unions, that's what we call our net worth. Right. So when we save up, so we have enough that when something happens that's shocking, we're able to withstand that and maybe outlast the competition without having to make too many changes because we've got our rainy day fund there. And then that adaptation, that's pivoting what you offer. That was the restaurants that during COVID went, I guess we are now a takeout service, right? Yep. And then finally that shaping advantage, which is the concept of being able to say, you know what, we're going to totally reinvent how something is done and we're going to do it on our own terms. So Airbnb is a great example of that, where they changed the environment so that people may be likely to go to an Airbnb instead of a hotel. Zoom changed an environment so somebody would do a video interview instead of going to an in-person meeting.
Uber, we now get in strangers' cars. We were told our entire lives not to get in cars with strangers.
Being able to not just pivot your own offerings, but truly shape how others do life because of the way you do that. And so those different ways to incorporate or to be resilient may change from organization to organization. A credit union may not be the first one to go with a shaping advantage, certainly a cushioning advantage, but they can also learn a lot from adaptation and anticipation too. And I think that varies depending on who's at the helm. And not just the CEO that's at the helm, but the board and the risk appetite of the board too. Because the reality is that with the exception of the cushioning advantage, although I'd say even with that one, there's a certain amount of risk that comes with being resilient. There's a certain amount of risk with going down in that water where you can't see anything and saying, nope, we're going to make it through. We're going to push past this, because you don't necessarily know what's on the other side of that shock that requires the need for resilience.
There was this thought that was popping into my head that we were recently talking to Crosby about. 13-year-old son here, right? That idea that anytime you do something for the first time, it's uncomfortable a lot of the times, right? Like that idea of like growth happens outside your comfort zone. And that to me is when I think of like a strong culture for credit unions and resilient credit unions, it's that idea that change is inevitable. That's the only thing constant, as they say, to use all these cliches. But if you've created the culture where failure could even be celebrated at times on certain things, right? Because it's just part of learning, and that idea that we are not going to be great the first attempt at it. One place and I think that goes into something that we've talked about before, but that idea of innovation, but the word that kept popping into my head was agility. If we're building organizations that are agile when things are great, it makes it a lot more easy for us to be resilient when things aren't the best too. If it's in our DNA to adapt, then whether it's happening internally or externally, we can adapt. And that's absolutely critical in that flexibility, that ability to change as the environment changes. I think there is a certain, as much as people are, everyone hates change. I don't think that's true at all. I'm a lover of change. Yeah, and so, but I don't think you have to be someone who is who is loving change in order to be resilient. I do think that you have to create the psychological safety that says, if we are trying to make changes,
and they're not all home runs. That's okay. We can try again. And how the leader responds to things that maybe don't go quite right is going to absolutely create that climate of resilience. Like if the team sees a leader model, if things go wrong, we're defeated, then the team may be less likely to try to flex or adapt.
You work with a ton of teams, right? And a lot of leaders. How do you empower your teams, though? The leader can set an example, as you're saying, which I firmly believe that's probably where you have to start, right? Like if the leader's not doing it, then why would anybody else think that they have the ability to do it? But how do you empower teams so that all levels of the credit union feel like and are encouraged to problem solve? Because, one of the things I always think of is a resilient organization always kind of goes back to who's the end user in a credit union. It's the member. And if it's CUInsight, it might be our readers or our partners. If I'm looking at, okay, what is that end user? What is that member like? What are they experiencing? It might not be the CEO who's having those conversations. We know it's not the one who's having those conversations. So how do you create teams that, and as a leader, how do you encourage problem solving at all levels? Like the people that are on the ground when things are maybe going a little wonky.
Yeah. Well, and it comes down to transparency and communication. We want our tellers to know what we think might be happening. So as they start to see early indicators, they can share that back and also help give us some ideas of what people are really experiencing. If we start to notice that we have members who are coming in and talking to us and sharing little insights that make us cognizant that they're having a little trouble making ends meet. If we hear from...
Probably shouldn't be offering vacation loans and stuff then, right? Like,
yeah. But there are early indicators. There are like, oh, I know that this member typically puts this much aside in savings from every paycheck. And today when they came in, they told us they weren't going to. Or we're seeing an uptick in members calling the contact center to check their balances. Like, why is that? Well, it's not typically because they're sitting there with $500 that's sort of just slushy in their account. It's because they're getting tighter on that. And so when the CEO, the C-suite, the leaders in the organization can say, we know there's some stuff happening. We're cognizant about what the price of eggs is today. We know our members might start to feel some financial pressures.
What eggs? I was just at the grocery store and there wasn't any. I don't know what you're talking about.
I guess that solves for the price of them if you can't buy them anyway. But
right, yeah. As far as I know, they haven't changed.
But then when somebody hears, oh, you're sharing this important information to me about what's happening out there, you're inviting me to tell you back what I'm seeing too. So if you include me, if you inform me, if you educate me about what we think might happen and those values that we're committed to standing by for our members, now I have permission to tell you, I think I'm seeing members having this problem, and maybe I'll go so far as to share an idea of how we might make their lives easier. But at a minimum, the person who's closest to the membership is conveying what they're actually seeing happen in the membership too.
I feel like we could talk on that topic for a long, long time. But I do want to get to we say leadership, we say credit unions, we also say life, because each of us, we're all our own whole humans too, right? So the last, if you want to say chunk, I wanted to make sure that you and I got to talk about, and one that I think maybe deeply passionate about, is the resilience in the personal side. The idea that leaders are still human too, and people too. So leading through uncertainty, we know can take a toll on people. The burnout is a real thing. I know we both have thoughts on this, but what advice do you have for leaders who want to build their own personal resilience so that they can keep showing up for their teams, their members, their communities, their families in difficult times?
Yeah. Don't lose sight of your community, your friends, your family, during those times. And that's, I mentioned that idea of the leader being at the center, and they're concerned about the well-being of the organization and the team and the employees and the members. And we talked a lot with Mike in episode 204 about that wheel of life concept.
Yep.
If a leader is finding themselves turned up to a 10 on career, it's all about the business, and they aren't making time for recreation, spirituality, physical well-being, like their health, right? Their loved ones, they're going to move themselves to burnout faster. Life, you need to be able to have that balanced life, I think, in those areas. And so being able to take that inventory and look for like how to make sure you're keeping the balance of it. And there may be times when you do need to turn it up, but taking that opportunity to say, okay, I'm not going to work 7-10 hour days straight this week. I am going to take a few hours off on Sunday to actually go relax or take a hike or get outside or whatever. So, but that's a good one for you, Randy, because you've been through, you and are quite good at designing a life. And I know you're laughing now because we just got back from GAC where everybody talked about whether or not you had shoes on the trip with you, but you built an organization. And so over time, you've had different phases of your life where I'm sure the work has been more like a 10. And so what have you learned during those periods of your time?
I'll apologize for the FedEx delivery driver that just rang our doorbell. We're recording this from home, so our dog Otis is now barking at it. So, anyways, but now that's the work-life integration, right? No.
Right.
I mean, you touched on many of the points that I always think about and talk about. And one thing is we have to have some self-awareness on like, what are our triggers? What are our stress points? How are we feeling? And if we don't know the difference in ourselves, other people can see it. So I'm a big fan of that idea of building in time to reflect. People that have listened to the podcast have heard me talk about journaling for years now. And it's something I do in the morning because it's kind of that touching base thing to start my day. It's something I know you do as well. So that's something. You mentioned another one, like you can't isolate yourself. That to me is a big thing, whether it's having a mentor, whether it's having a coach, but it's also your peer networks that are around there, people that you just trust that you can talk to. They might not have the answers, but you got to be able to talk to somebody. And when I think of like CEOs, sometimes you don't want to show that vulnerability to your teams. But guess what? There's another CEO who doesn't want to show that vulnerability to their teams either. Or maybe there's that mentor or coach that you already had set up before things got wonky, where you could do that. I am a huge believer in work-life integration. Something that Mike said was that idea of like, sometimes you run at a 10 and work takes up more. Sometimes it takes a little bit less. You know, like you could be going through something. Maybe it's an external challenge. Maybe it's a challenge that you've brought on yourself, like a core conversion or something of that nature. But I am a huge, huge believer in setting boundaries. You and I did an episode a couple of years back on yes and no. You love to say yes because you're like, it's such an excellent opportunity. No is my favorite answer to anything. I was literally just on the plane coming back from GAC thinking about an autoresponder to my email that was like, if you're asking about this, or this, it's just a no. I don't do that anymore. Like I don't speak at conferences because I don't like to. It's not my comfort zone. I love a podcast, but like me standing on a stage talking is just not fun to me, right? So it's not something that I do. And to me, that is kind of setting up that balance. The one other thing is, and you and I have talked a ton about this as well, just in our conversations as we go for walks or we have these conversations, is that idea of being curious. That curiosity of kind of lifelong learning, and no matter what it is, it doesn't always have to be about work. It can be about something completely outside of work, right? But having that curiosity, even to me, makes change less scary because it's like, oh, this is a time I can learn something new. I think back to, maybe it was only last year or whatever, but like when ChatGPT was first coming out on the scene and stuff like that, there was like a whole group of people that were like, this is horrible. It's going to stop whatever. But then there was a whole group too that was like, what can I do with it? And almost sharing a different thing they figured out they could do. That to me was the curiosity of what is this thing? Who knows what it's going to do? And I think that's, to me, a sign of personal resilience too, is to be able to look at yourself and say, how am I continuing to grow? How am I continuing to learn? What are all these balances I have in life? So that was a whole lot of stuff. But yeah, I love the idea of work-life integration, and I love the idea of being very intentional about it, because that's something that you and I have talked about before. It's something that I've talked to a lot of different leaders about before, is like, we have commitments, and if we've made those commitments, we still have to follow through on those commitments. So life generally can't change tomorrow, but you can look at how you're making commitments of your time down the road. And then someday you get to that point where you're like, oh, life isn't as hectic or crazy as it once was. And to me, that does allow you to be a little more balanced and a little more resilient. Your buckets aren't overflowing. How about that? So,
all right. So we've talked about resilient leaders. We've talked about resilient teams and organizations. And we've talked about building resilience in ourselves. As we've moved through it all and moved through those conversations, now it's time for the one key takeaway. So for our discussion on resilience today, what's that key takeaway? Either that thing you learned, that thing you'd want to double down on, or that thing you're hoping listeners take away for their own continued journeys.
The one thing that keeps coming back to me, it was something from like very early in the conversation, but it did stick into my head, is like this idea, and the way the term kept coming back in my head was being resilient isn't just about like bouncing back, it's actually bouncing forward. So how do you use adversity to grow and have that mindset where it's like, ooh, like we can come back from this better. And I would say, and I think it's something you said about being a strong credit union financially, about being a strong position in your community, you can come back better. Like, because you never know what people around you are going to do, or you never know what organizations around are going to do in that time. So if that idea of like not just bouncing back, like we'll get back to where we were, but bouncing better, that's what I would leave it with.
Oh, I like it. There's like a tagline there. Right. Don't just bounce back, bounce better.
Bounce better.
Absolutely. And with that, I think my key takeaway from the conversation today is really this thought on the role of leaders in creating resilience, and this recognition that the leader is who sets the emotional climate of the organization. And so they have to create a culture of stability, confidence, and innovation or adaptability in order to keep that moving forward. And so when I think about that idea of stability or confidence, I know that at least is what is true of me, but I see it in the leaders I coach and I see it in the leaders I work with, that we get stability and confidence when we make sure we're taking care of ourselves. So you can't run at 110 and scream at people to keep up with you and try to keep that pace and project stability or confidence in that. That's when instead it does project more of or set that tone for chaos. And you may be able to drag people along for a bit at that speed. But if you're not taking care of yourself, it's not going to be sustainable. And your organization might be able to push for a while, but it won't be that organization that bounces better. And it may not even be that organization that bounces back.
Well, bounces back, right? If you burn everybody out. So I like that. I love that idea of adaptability and running at 110%. So anyways, this was a fun conversation. I knew it would be. I hope that all of you listening liked it as well. A quick recap as we always do here. Just a few things before we go. As always, we'll link to everything we talked about today in the show notes. So if there's any books we mentioned or anything like that, we'll link all over, like the last podcast. So with Mike, I suggest you highly listen to that one if you haven't yet. As always, Jill, and I've even kind of started to dip my toes back into it. We're active on LinkedIn, so we'd love to hear from you there. Share your thoughts, ask questions, give feedback, suggest future topics. I mentioned we have a couple awesome guests coming up here, so but you could even suggest guests that you would think would be fun to have in on these conversations and keep this conversation going there as well. A big thank you to our sponsor, Trellance. Trellance is a leading technology partner for credit unions, and they have been a great supporter of ours and the podcast, making it possible to have this much fun doing what we do. So be sure to check them out in the show notes, and then please show them some love. If you haven't already, subscribe to the CUInsight Experience podcast on your favorite podcast player. We're on them all. And, if you're looking for a book read, not only from this episode, but from the past 205 now, a quick Google of the CUInsight Experience podcast book list, and your next great read is on its way from Amazon or Audible or wherever you get your books. Last but certainly not least, a huge thank you to all of you for listening. Y'all rock. We appreciate each and every one of you, and be well, friends.
Thank you.